Club of Portland Friday Forum. I'm Colin Jones, President-elect of City Club. For more than 100 years, the City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel and welcome all of you joining us on X-Ray FM, Open Signals Community Media television station, or KGW's website, Facebook feed, or news app. The generous support of City Club's media partners and corporate sponsors enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to recognize City Club's winter sponsor, Portland General Electric. KGW Media Group has also generously sponsored today's program. Please show our appreciation to everyone who has made today's event possible with a round of applause. To today's program. We've all seen the hashtag and read stories that range from nauseating to horrific. The code of silence that's kept those stories of abuse from being reported is finally breaking. However, a hashtag can only do so much. Laws and policies that create safer and more equitable workplaces may not be as exciting as daily revelations on Twitter, but they are the backbone of real change. Today, our panel of distinguished lawyers and labor experts will take a closer look at the laws that exist, the laws that still need to be written, and the role of extra-legal action, such as public shaming, in creating change. Joining us today is Mariann Hyland, an Assistant Vice Provost in the Office of the Provost and Academic Affairs at the University of Oregon, Dana Sullivan, a partner at Buchanan, Angeli, Altschult, and Sullivan, and Lisa Lesage, the Executive Director of Immigration Counseling Service. Interviewing them today is Laurel Porter, an award-winning journalist with the KGW Media Group. Ms. Porter can be seen on multiple KGW news shows and is host of KGW's weekly current affairs program, Straight Talk. Please join me in welcoming them all.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'm honored to be the moderator for this important City Club forum. The MeToo movement, we've heard all about it. It's become such a cultural, seismic shift in the nation. Time magazine made its 2017 Person of the Year, not one person, but a group of people. Time called them the silence breakers for shedding light on rampant sexual harassment and misconduct in the workplace and beyond. The silence breakers include Oregon's own state senator, Sarah Gelser. Last fall, Senator Gelser came forward with her story, accusing a fellow state senator of touching her inappropriately over a period of years at our legislature. Time magazine's editor-in-chief called the Me Too movement the fastest growing social change we have seen in decades, and it's affecting workplaces of every kind across America and right here in Oregon. Although we see claims of sexual harassment in nearly every industry, it's likely more widespread than we realize. The acting chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission says only about 30% of women who experience harassment ever complain internally. Even fewer file a charge, although she says companies can still be aware the inappropriate behavior is occurring. And it touches our vulnerable communities too, workers in low-wage jobs, immigrants, people of color, women who have a language barrier and may not know where to turn. Few resources are available to them. What does all of this mean to the men and women in today's workplace and for our employers? We do have an esteemed panel of the best legal minds specializing in this area with us today, 3 Oregon attorneys, and I'm going to just give you a brief bio. They have such long and impressive resumes, but for today's purposes, so we can really get to the heart of the matter, I'm going to keep the intros brief. Dana Sullivan is partner at Buchanan, Angeli, Altschult, and Sullivan. She is one of the most highly regarded lawyers in Oregon, representing individuals in employment and civil rights litigation. She regularly tries discrimination cases in both federal and state court, and also devotes a significant part of her practice to advising executives in the negotiation of employment contracts or separation agreements. Mariann Hyland, over there on the end, is an Assistant Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at the University of Oregon. Mariann has more than 18 years of experience in institution-wide management. She served Oregon Health and Science University for 10 years, where she provided leadership for civil rights compliance and diversity and inclusion. And because it's such a large employer, she handled a high volume of sexual harassment complaints. And today she is speaking as a private individual, not representing U of O. Lisa Lesage is the Executive Director of Immigration Counseling Service, ICS. Oregon's oldest and only independent nonprofit law firm serving immigrants, unaccompanied minors, and trafficking victims since 1978. Prior to joining ICS last summer, she spent 5 years in the Middle East as Morocco country director and senior legal advisor in Istanbul, Turkey, for the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. She has a long history of working on human rights, immigration, and workers' rights cases. Please welcome our panel. So let's set the stage. So how would you describe what effect the MeToo and more recently the Time's Up movements, how they're having an effect on workplaces across America and right here in Oregon? Let's start with Lisa.
Well, actually, this is probably better directed at the other two. I can say that I think, especially for the populations that I work with that are low-wage workers in very small businesses, many of them kind of what we call in the shadows, that are oftentimes working alone, such as hotel workers, janitors, things like that. I think that there's a growing awareness there, but it really hasn't crept up or bubbled up the way it has in more of what I would call corporate America. So I think that there are definitely wonderful groups that are beginning to work with these folks, but not so much as what we're seeing on the national scale, I think, or in larger industries.
From your experience, what are you seeing, Dana?
Well, I'd say there are two positive effects of the Me Too movement. One being the international conversation about issues related to sexual harassment and sexual assault. And I think it's raising public awareness about how prevalent this sort of conduct is and what an inhibition it's been for women to attain equality in whatever culture they may be living in. The other is I do think corporate America has taken note, and I'm frequently asked whether I'm being inundated with calls. I represent employees in employment discrimination cases of all kinds. People ask me if I'm being inundated with calls by women seeking to pursue sexual harassment cases, and I'm actually not. I have had them steadily throughout my career, but we are getting calls because my firm also advises employers to do trainings. And I know that they're doing trainings at the Oregon Judicial Department, in the Legislature, in private corporations. So I do think that people are being educated by their own employers, and employers are looking at their own policies, which is really a wonderful thing.
And Mariann.
I see this moment as a reinvigoration of a civil rights movement and the right to advance, a movement to advance the rights of women, and it's been a struggle that we've had in this nation since our founding. If we pause and remember history, it wasn't until 1920 when the 19th Amendment of the Federal Constitution was ratified, which gave women the right to vote. So that's less than 100 years ago. It was earlier than that in Oregon, but this is part of a continuum of a movement, and it's very exciting to see that this movement is touching people throughout our entire society, whether it's low-wage workers, immigrant workers, highlighted in the Reveal investigative journalism out of California, the stories we've heard about high tech, the blog, the infamous blog of the engineer at Uber that went viral, to what's happening in Hollywood now. I think it's an exciting moment for a national dialogue and an opportunity for us to take it to a new level.
Mariann, it's interesting too because a lot of people think the Me Too movement was started by Alyssa Milano, the actress, on Twitter, but it was actually started by a black woman, Tarana Burke, 10 years ago. So what changed? She didn't get a lot of attention for it then.
No, she didn't, but I think what changed was, I think in part Hollywood got the courage and they were inspired by what Tarana did. And the Reveal investigative journalism out of California, they also were in touch with Hollywood and creating a partnership. So what we see, I think, is a multicultural, multiracial, multi-generational movement involving people on the full continuum of the socioeconomic spectrum. So in that way, I think it's truly remarkable. I don't know that we've ever seen anything quite like this because we have social media to help bring people together, but we do have some historical versions of this in the past, and this is a sort of a reiteration and a strengthening of the prior movements.
Let's define what sexual harassment is, and I'll turn to Dana for that. What is the legal definition, and also how is that different than what an employee might experience and feel as sexual harassment?
Well, that's a great way to pose the question, because what the courts deem to be sexual harassment is different than what you and I or most lay people would consider to be sexual harassment. The legal definition is that it's comments or conduct that, at least in the sexual harassment context, are sexual in nature or are directed at an individual because of his or her sex. And the law requires that to sustain a sexual harassment claim, the claimant needs to prove that the conduct is severe or pervasive. And they also need to establish that it's not only subjectively offensive or unwelcome, but a court would need to find that it's objectively reasonable for that individual to have found that conduct to be offensive. So it results, those requirements of pervasiveness or severity, and that the individual objectively be perceiving the conduct as unwelcome, really allows courts to find against claimants in many, many of these cases.
And let's talk about a poll that really shows how prevalent it is. A poll last fall may help to explain why the MeToo movement resonated with women so quickly. 54% of women said they experienced unwanted and inappropriate sexual advances at some point in their lives. All told, the poll found 33 million U.S. women have been sexually harassed and 14 million sexually abused in work-related incidents. And it said nearly all women, 95%, report the male perpetrators of such abuse usually go unpunished. I want to find out from all of you, do you think that's representative of Oregon? And I know, Lisa, in the field that you're working in, it's hard to gauge that, but do you think that it's becoming more pronounced in your area of expertise?
I don't know that you mean the activity, the sexual harassment, or the women reporting it?
The women, the sexual harassment, because the women don't know where to go with the immigrants that you're working with.
I would say that I don't know that it's more prevalent. I think that it's nowadays. I think this has been going on all the time, and I think the issue is people just haven't had the conduit to be able to speak up so that they're heard, right? So we were dealing with this 30 years ago, and what's really exciting for me about this is I think that women are beginning to feel like now they're being listened to. So you just kind of look at, for example, women working in the fields 30 years ago were undergoing this type of harassment all the time, and there was no way that they could report this. The Bureau of Labor and Industries didn't have any kind of culturally appropriate way, or it was usually a older white male who was sitting behind a desk. There was no way to report it. I think now it's very exciting because there are a lot of people where the lid's kind of been ripped off a lot of these activities, which, and I kind of look at the intersectionality of things when I think about, we were doing cases 30 years ago, but we weren't calling them trafficking, we were calling them slavery cases. Now there's all this awareness about human trafficking, which really overlaps a lot with a lot of these women working in industries, home health care, nannies, homework cleaners, like I said, people that are in the margins and the shadows, that now there's attention being paid to it, not only by women, but also by lawyers like Dana, who are doing volunteer work for people that are not able to access lawyers, but also even law enforcement coming to recognize that this kind of thing is happening. So I don't know that there's an increase. I think it's just that women have now some avenues where their voices are being heard, and they just weren't being heard before.
You mentioned sex trafficking. Why is it such a problem in our area?
Well, that's a topic for a whole other City Club thing, I think, but it boils down to, in a nutshell, what is Oregon's First Amendment the equivalent of the free speech, has an extremely liberal and broad interpretation of free speech. And so most of the commentators and pundits would say that as a result of that, Oregon has one of the highest concentrations of sex industries per capita of any state in the union, especially in Portland. And so this is, of course, led to, and being on the I-5 corridor, this has then led to quite a high number of trafficking instances. So, you know, that's the legal pundits, I should say.
But a lot of the women that you work with are more vulnerable to that.
Yes, the foreign-born women, and I would say native-born women too. This is a cohort that's been ignored, but there's quite an instance of native women who are also victimized by trafficking, and especially foreign-born women. You know, there's cases just recently, a couple weeks ago, in a hotel on I-5 North, just outside of Wilsonville, where there was a large group of Chinese women that were brought over here, told that they would be going to massage school, and the hotel it was a nice hotel, had absolutely no idea that this was going on. It was so well hidden. So, I mean, I think it's one of those things that is going on right in front of our faces, and we don't know about it. So the good thing is to recognize what some of these indicators are, so people are then more aware of it.
Thank you, Lisa. Mariann, for 10 years, you handled sexual harassment allegations when you worked for OHSU. You also told me that you were instrumental in bringing Anita Hill to speak in Portland for the first time, and many will remember that Anita Hill brought sexual harassment to the forefront in 1991 during the Senate confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, when she accused Thomas of continuously sexually harassing her during her time as his employee. And laws, we talked about this earlier, that when you and I talked on the phone, that laws were passed after that, and you thought the laws evolved and that you were surprised to see what's happening now. What happened? Why do we find ourselves in this environment right now?
So first of all, I do want to credit my very good friend, Donna Butler, for being very instrumental in bringing Anita Hill to Portland, and I worked closely with her on that project. It was a project called the Job Equity Coalition, and part of the purpose was to advance the rights of workers. So in terms of bringing Anita Hill here, and when what she highlighted was sexual harassment during the confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas is an African-American justice. So it was somewhat controversial because Anita Hill herself is also African-American. And she came out and reported fairly severe and significant sexual harassment against him. And it was debated during the hearings. And you know, maybe there are many people in this room who remember that. It was very public. It was very humiliating. I would say that she was denigrated. And but what she did was, in her bravery, was highlight the pervasiveness of sexual harassment in those arenas and how devastating it is and can be to people in their careers. So I think what I noticed after that, and you know, I was a fairly new lawyer at the time, was that the laws started evolving, the case law in particular, around sexual harassment, and people began to have a lot more awareness about it. And I think a lot more women came out and started divulging their experiences, and I think Anita Hill really inspired that.
Do you think that a lot of people, though, didn't believe Anita Hill at the time? Do you think she'd be believed today? Yes.
When, you know, what was so strange about watching that moment, and everybody should go back and watch some YouTube clips. Congress was mostly white men at the time, and it really pretty much still is, with a few more women, and you know, but it was all these white men grilling Anita and doubting her, and in some ways it looked like she was blamed as the victim and made to be wrong or bad or immoral. And so today, in this moment, if Anita Hill had come forward, I would like to think she would have gotten a lot more support. I truly believe she would have, and probably she would have inspired more people to also come out, and then maybe we would have had that snowball effect. But back then, we have to remember the historical context, and these movements take time, and they're iterative, and they depend and they rest on the work of others who've sacrificed and have had the courage to come forward and to tell their stories.
You mentioned Congress, and on the national level, before Senator Al Franken and Representative John Conyers Jr., who both announced their departures amid multiple sexual harassment allegations recently, there was Oregon Senator Bob Packwood, an ambitious senator who eyed the presidency, then found himself resigning in disgrace in 1995. The Washington Post ran a front-page story that Sunday detailing allegations of misconduct and inappropriate sexual advances. And 10 women, many former staffers, told their horror stories to the Post. That was in 1995. As we see a wave of allegations now against powerful men in all types of industries, how much has really changed since Bob Packwood? I want to turn the question to Dana, because we're seeing in our own legislature questions about sexual harassment. You represent Sarah Gelser. I know you can't speak specifically about that case, but can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the culture of our own legislature when it comes to sexual harassment?
Absolutely. I mean, this is since the November when allegations started coming out in all sectors, including in state legislators. There are now, I think, there have been accusations of sexual harassment, sustained accusations of sexual harassment in 25 different state legislatures, including Oregon's. I will say, with a hopeful note on the national front, that it's as a direct consequence of the Packwood situation that Congress is even subject to the laws prohibiting sexual harassment in employment at all. At the time that those women came forward, there was no legal protection for them. They did not have the right to pursue a claim for damages for the horrible humiliation that they suffered. And as a consequence of the Packwood situation, they passed the Congressional Accountability Act, which subjected members of Congress to sexual harassment allegations or liability. And we now know, because there's also been a discussion on the national level about the challenges that women still face because of the arcane process they need to go through if they're pursuing a claim against a member of Congress. But that is progress. I will say that at the state legislative level, there has not been the same examination that the Packwood case caused to occur in Congress. And as in any setting where you have individuals with power and individuals without, the individuals with power can abuse that power, and it's easy for it to go unchecked. And unfortunately, we have experienced some of that in Oregon. And, you know, if one looks at the process that individuals who have a complaint against a member of the Oregon legislature have to go through, or the process that a individual with a complaint against a member of our judiciary in Oregon needs to go through, these processes are decades behind the complaint procedures that are applicable in the private sector. And I don't see any justification for the difference. But we need to look hard at those procedures, and we need to get people in those settings trained. So we need to bring the public sector on par with the private sector in terms of awareness of these issues, sensitivity to these issues, and support for women who are experiencing this sort of discrimination.
Thank you, Dana. For our broadcast audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Laurel Porter, and I'm speaking with Mariann Hyland, Assistant Vice Provost at the University of Oregon, Dana L. Sullivan, a partner at Buchanan, Angeli, Altschulte, and Sullivan, and Lisa Lesage, the Executive Director of Immigration Counseling Service. Mariann, I'd like to talk a little bit about the sexual harassment victim. What does harassment, from your experience at OHSU for 10 years, what does harassment and someone coming forward with a charge, what does that do to the victim?
So it's not uncommon for women, because women are disproportionately the victims of sexual assault and violence, to have some sort of prior history that makes the incident that they've experienced at work all the more traumatic for them. So, you know, really the range of complaints can be from somebody touched me inappropriately, on somebody just experiencing a violation of physical boundaries, but it's not sexual, to you know, an allegation of sexual assault. But I would say most people, when they come forward, they have given a lot of thought to it. They've done some soul searching, and it's a pretty agonizing thing to do. But typically, there's a great sense of relief that they know that someone's there who's going to listen to them. is going to look into it and is going to assure them of protections against confidentiality. But I will say there's a great deal of stress involved in coming forward and that it's very difficult.
Lisa, from the women that you've worked with, you've talked about something called generational trauma. Can you tell us what that is?
Well, it's basically, and again, this ties nicely into what Mariann was saying, is that if you're growing up in a community where women have been abused, and then there's intrafamilial abuse on top of that, there's almost like a unconscious learned response to that type of behavior. And so you'll see that it could be in any community, right? Here in the United States, whether white, African American, or immigrant communities, but sometimes you'll see this actually frequently in a refugee population where people are fleeing violence, where, for example, there's paramilitary troops that have been terrorizing villages for years, then there's intrafamilial violence, and you get this built in not only with the women, but also how the men act and react to that type of thing. So then when it happens here, their reaction is sort of layered in every part of your being. You're not going to trust even if you say, well, this person's here to help you, I'm a lawyer from legal aid, I'm speaking your language, there's still that complete and total, and oftentimes people will look at it as a refusal to get help, when in fact it's rooted in this trauma of just the inability to be able to express what's happening, and to have a process to be able to do that. So this is something that we see in immigrant or in refugee populations, but also here in the United States. And I think it's something to be aware of. Oftentimes we as lawyers, I remember as a young lawyer, it's like, I want the facts, what happened? And that's not always the best way to find out what happened, because you're re-traumatizing somebody or you're not really getting at what actually happened. So we have been starting to work with psychologists who are trained cross-culturally in terms of how can we have a conversation more effectively with clients, especially with women, so that we're able to get this information. And we work with a large population of children under the age of 18, young girls who've experienced a lot of abuse. And so how can we most effectively have these kinds of conversations so we're not re-traumatizing the person, but we're able to get the information that we need to help them with a legal case. And that's always a very severe tension between lawyers and the client. And I think probably in these, even if you're dealing with somebody like me, white middle-class woman, to have to talk about these things is difficult enough. But then when I've got these other layers on top of that, it's even more difficult.
Mariann, from the employer's point of view, what happens when a complaint comes in? How should companies handle it and make sure that the accused gets due process?
So there are a lot of best practices around how to handle complaints, and it's a best practice to have a policy that sets forth a process that provides for confidentiality, that protects people against retaliation, that takes these complaints seriously, that thoroughly investigates them. It's important to have well-trained investigators. It's a very specialized skill set. And just a shout out to my colleagues, former colleagues at OHSU who are here today, who do that work day in and day out. And it's a labor of love. And it's also very, very stressful. So it's important to triage a case when it comes in. Typically, you want to find out how severe is this. If it's a case that involves some sort of sexual assault or a rape, then typically what you need to do is immediately put the respondent on paid leave, typically is the way it works. For public sector, pending the results of the investigation. So for public sector employers, there's the Constitution in Oregon, the federal Constitution, which requires due process. So that means the respondent gets notice of the allegations and an opportunity to be heard. And in order to have a robust complaint process that's viewed as credible in an institution, there does need to be a perception that it's objective, that it gives people an opportunity on both sides to be heard. So that's always a difficult balance sometimes, but it's very important. And in terms of the private sector, which doesn't have those same constitutional requirements, I don't know if Dana has anything to add about how in the private sector employers are typically handling these complaints.
Dana, do you want to add to that?
Well, I would say, I mean, while there may not be a legal obligation to provide due process in the private sector, any employer is going to want their procedure, their policy for handling these sorts of complaints to be a fair one to all involved. That's going to be a benefit corporate culture overall. It's going to minimize the challenges that they'll face to any decision they may make as a consequence of their investigation. So I would say, in terms of employer policies that I've seen, the process is not all that different from what Mariann described, and that both the person coming forward with the complaint and the person who's been accused would have the opportunity to speak to an investigator, provide names of witnesses, or other information supporting their position, would be kept apprised of the investigation. And for everyone's sake, it needs to happen expediently.
Let's talk about what we can do to facilitate change. And the National Women's Law Center set up a network of women attorneys across the country who've agreed to provide free consultation for women facing harassment and sexual assault. And Dana, you've agreed to be a part of that. Tell us more about that and how that might bring about change.
Well, I would say when, I have heard the MeToo movement criticized as being the product of elite women in Hollywood who really aren't connected with reality. And I think that it's hard to maintain that criticism when you see the concrete action that's actually coming out of the MeToo movement. So we now know about Time's Up, which was launched January 1st. And there are very concrete changes in the works, both on a policy level and on a legal level. So Time's Up has paired with the National Women's Law Center. There is a network of women. It's called the Women's Legal Equity Network. It's nationwide, and anyone can go to the National Women's Law Center website, can find names of attorneys in their area who will agree to meet with them for free and consult with them about a potential sexual harassment case. And then even more powerfully, I think, the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund has been established that is being maintained by or overseen by the National Women's Law Center, that when last I read 2 or 3 days ago had raised $16 million thus far to provide support to women who are pursuing these types of claims. So if I were to get a referral from the National Women's Law Center of a woman in Oregon who wishes to pursue a sexual harassment complaint, I can apply to this fund administered back in Washington to have her court costs paid and other costs associated with the litigation. So that, I cannot tell you how much of a help that will be for women who are seeking legal help for these types of claims. The other very concrete action that's come out of the Time's Up movement is they also, in addition to having the legal working committee, they have a policy working committee that is putting together a slate of legislation to be pursued in various states and at the federal level that include things like making independent contractors subject to the protections of the sexual harassment laws. Because right now, if you're an independent contractor working for a company and you're subject to sexual harassment by the company employee who oversees your work, you don't have a claim. And so that's one idea. Another idea is to limit the circumstances in which these settlements of these types of claims could be handled confidentially, or legislation requiring private sector employers to report on a regular basis about the claims that they're subject to, those that have been sustained. So there's a wonderfully well-developed legislative slate that I think could really bring about a lot of positive change as well.
And Lisa, what do you think can be done to help protect the communities that are vulnerable, living more in the shadows?
Well, I think a lot of what Dana mentioned is a huge step in that direction. I really think that it's, those types of activities are going to benefit everybody, right? So regardless of where they're living. And I think especially one of the things that needs to be focused on is with the mechanisms that are in place, such as Bureau of Labor and Industries, most of the companies in Oregon are small businesses, and especially those out in more rural or isolated areas that, we can advocate for having a much stronger and more robust mechanism within those institutions to be able to respond to that type of thing. I also think it's kind of important personally for us in our communities and in our workplaces when we're looking at, and making sure that we're encouraging diversity and encouraging women to speak up, is that we think about something that my law partners I had when I was a young lawyer, all men, 2 men of color, what they did for me, and that was that they facilitated opportunities for me, for my professional growth. And then they stepped aside. So I was able to walk through the door. They didn't walk through the door in front of me. They let me walk through the door. And then they accompanied me when I asked, but not put themselves in the place. And I think if we kind of think of that in that context, that this is something that we can do when we're dealing with people that look different than us, when we're looking at the, working with immigrant communities, is to be thinking about that. It's not this sort of stepping in and how can I help? It's really thinking about how can I facilitate opportunities and then step aside and let your voices be heard and accompany you where need be. So I just think that, those kinds of personal things are really important, along with the policy levels also. And there's nonprofits that are doing wonderful work representing these workers as well in culturally appropriate contexts, like Northwest Workers Justice Project and Pei-Kun and some of these other organizations. So, opening pocketbooks is helpful too.
That always helps. Mariann, what works in the workplace to prevent harassment? What should employers do?
So first of all, I think a very strong commitment at the highest levels of the organization, starting with the chief administrator, the president, CEO, which then filters down. And that can be disseminated through talking about the values of supporting women and people of color, and ensuring that there's equity and equality going on in the workplace, and that there's a strong policy behind it that everybody knows about, that's transparent, that the process to investigate is fair, and that it's done in an expeditious manner, that people get results, that they feel confident in it, and that there's accountability, so that if somebody violates the policy of the company, that they're held accountable for it. And so all of those things, along with training, making sure everybody's aware of their rights and their responsibilities, are all important factors.
What happens when there's a complaint that doesn't rise to the legal standard, but there still might be a problem in the workplace that maybe is going unaddressed? What kind of atmosphere can that create in the workplace, and what can be done about it?
So Dana talked about the pretty high legal threshold that you have to prove for sexual harassment. And so sometimes the behavior won't rise to the level of what would be considered sexual harassment based on the law, which policies typically mirror. So sometimes we hear about the term bullying. Bullying, I don't know if you've heard of an equal opportunity bully. That's that idea of somebody who's just kind of rude and mean to everybody, but it's not necessarily focused on someone's gender. So the idea of having employers having some sort of respect policy or code of conduct is really a good idea, because it provides a way to call out behavior that's inappropriate, that's considered unacceptable by the standards and norms of the employer, but doesn't necessarily rise to the level of sexual harassment.
Dana, you touched on this a little bit, but are there any policies or laws that could be changed here in Oregon? You mentioned like mandatory arbitration, non-disclosure, confidentiality agreements that keep women from being able to talk about it and find out if there are other women who have endured the same thing.
Well, we're in Oregon, we're actually better off than women in other states and in the federal courts, because our state laws that prohibit discrimination in the workplace apply to employers of any size. So as long as you have one employee, and that if that employee were to feel discriminated against, specifically sexually harassed, she could pursue a claim. In the federal courts, you have to have 15 employees to be covered by the federal laws that prohibit sexual harassment in employment. So there are a lot of small employers who aren't covered, whose employees are really at risk if there's a harasser working in the work environment. So the other difference between Oregon law and federal law is that federal law caps the amount of money that a woman can recover for the emotional cost of harassment, and also caps the amount of damages the employer may have to pay as a punitive measure if they really intentionally or willfully disregarded harassment in the workplace. In Oregon, we don't have those same caps, and so a jury has the opportunity, presented facts that would merit a substantial award of damages, to award whatever the jury would find to be appropriate. So, but I do think that we can't really deal with arbitration on the state level, but that's something I would like to see the federal legislature explore, is whether mandatory arbitration provisions that require an individual with a claim against a company to handle that claim in private arbitration rather than going to court. Those are very frequently parts of employment agreements that employees sign without even reading them, or part of the employer's policies. And so that's been the subject of a lot of discussion at the federal level.
We only have a couple minutes before we take audience questions, but I did want to ask, and I'll ask Mariann, what can men do? How can they be allies in this Me Too and Time's Up movement? How can they help put an end to sexual harassment?
You know, that's a good question. I think that it begins with self-awareness. I think men need to think about maybe some of the benefits or privileges that they've had. They need to think about how to be allies. I think this is a time for all of us, actually, regardless of gender, to really think about how we interact with one another at work, at home, amongst our friends, and to bring more conscious awareness to the things that we do and the things that we say.
Thank you. Thank you to our panel. Now let's go to the audience for some questions. If you have a written question on an index card, hold it high for the staff to collect. You can also submit questions through Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum, and I'll try to read at least one index card question and a Twitter question. We invite our City Club members to ask their questions at the microphone. Asking questions at Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Please identify yourself before you ask your question as a City Club member, and ask one question in 30 seconds or less. Go ahead, thank you.
Paul Milius, City Club member. To begin with, I'd like to term myself a born-again feminist, but for today's topic, I think the message we have to drive home to men is, if you wouldn't want it done to or said to your mother, your wife, your daughter, your sister, don't do it or say it to her.
Okay, next question.
Hi, I'm Terry Martin, City Club member. I am so encouraged to see the Me Too movement. It's really a great thing, and I've been reading a lot of essays and new thinking about the term sexual harassment, and I think I'm glad to hear you bring up the notion of bullying, because I think sexual harassment can be a narrow term, or thought of as a narrow term, especially legally, and there are a lot of instances, especially, for instance, in blue-collar occupations that are traditionally male, where women can be bullied and intimidated and demeaned without it being particularly sexualized. So I'm wondering whether that kind of situation is covered under sexual harassment provisions and policies, whether you think it should be, or if there are other regulations that speak to that kind of bullying.
Who would like to take that question?
I think I can respond since I laid out the definition originally. I think that what is required to pursue a sexual harassment complaint is that you be able to demonstrate that the harassment is because of sex. So that doesn't mean it needs to be sexual necessarily. If you have, I have had a case, many of them, where you have a male boss, the typical bully, who treats women in the workplace in a humiliating, bullying fashion, but doesn't treat the men in the same way. And it may have nothing to do with sex, but I've had the stapler thrower and the yeller and that sort of type of behavior. If that behavior is directed towards women and not to men, that is a sexual harassment case, even though the conduct isn't sexual.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. Even though the conversation today is about the workplace, my question is, in your experience and observation, what are some of the behaviors and programs that can help these things from happening by working with kids in school or people before they get to the workplace that these behaviors are inappropriate?
Who would like to take that?
I'll go ahead and give it a try. When my daughter was in grade school, I was volunteering in her classroom, and I think this was the second grade, and there was actually an anti-bullying curriculum that was presented by the school counselor, and I was very pleased to see that because they talked about the role of the bystander too, and really reinforced the values of sticking up for people who are being bullied too, and taught the kids tools and resources for how to address being bullied. So I think those sorts of programs are great, and I don't know how widespread that is. I know that schools have suffered from lack of funding for that type of curriculum at times. So if parents can get involved at the local level and get involved with their school boards and advocate for those sorts of trainings and interventions, I think it would be very helpful.
I'll chime in and make another plug for the National Women's Law Center. They have on their website a study about the number of girls who are dropping out of school because they're experiencing sexual harassment of some type by peers or teachers. And so another initiative of the law centers is to address harassment in the schools to keep girls in school graduating. So it's an important issue, and I do think it's being addressed.
Thank you for your question. The next question, please.
Kurt Wavery, member. There's a larger issue of this misogyny within the culture, and I'm wondering if this effort might want to broaden its efforts around things, for example, the differentiation in pay scales for women, or look around at the percent of CEOs who are women and it's low, and so on and so forth. So do you think that this effort will begin to expand into those efforts also?
You want to tackle that, Lisa?
Well, I think so, and I definitely hope so. We've seen that at least in some projects in other parts of the world, where when we're working with women, we also start working with men in the community at the exact same time, and so and with the children, and so there's an intersectionality there. You're not just dealing with women, you're not just dealing with men, but you're focusing on these groups and then bringing them together as you're moving forward so that there's this consciousness there, right, of these types of activities and the inappropriateness or different ways of behaving to get to the same result. So the other thing too, I think that's oftentimes very difficult is that there's a perception in many men's minds, and I don't think it's just in other countries, it's here too, that if a woman is earning more money, that somehow takes away from my power, and it's a very debilitating feeling. And to work with men around that and talking we've had some experience with that, with working with men at a very basic level about the woman's contribution to the family and to the income and that kind of thing. That actually is met with some great success. And so I really think that that's incredibly important when we're thinking about these kinds of trainings.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to read a question before we have another from our City Club members from the audience. We talked earlier about the problem with sexual harassment at our own legislature, and the audience member wants to know, what is the policy for complaints in the Oregon legislature? Dana, can you answer that?
Well, it's complicated, which is part of the problem, and the path your complaint takes differs depending on whether you're complaining about a legislative employee or a member of the legislature. If you're complaining about a member of the legislature, as Senator Gelser has done, then you have the option of making an informal complaint or a formal complaint. And depending on how you wish to characterize your complaint, it's addressed differently. That's odd. But if you characterize it as a formal complaint, then it's required that an investigation be done within 90 days. Your complaint has to be submitted in writing. The investigation has to be completed within 90 days. You're given a draft of the report, as is the individual who's been accused of harassment. The caucus, the leader of the caucus of the individual against whom the complaint has been made is notified. Everybody gets to weigh in on the report before it's finalized. Once the report is finalized, then there's a relatively short period of time within which the conduct committee for that chamber has to meet and hold a hearing. And people, the accused and the accuser can propose witnesses, but there's no opportunity to question witnesses. That's to be handled by the committee. That part of the process could be improved, in my opinion. Then the results, there's a recommendation that is communicated by the conduct committee to the leadership, and it is the leadership that decides what, if anything, will be done, and whatever their decision is needs to be approved by 2/3 of the legislature by vote. So you can see what the likelihood that any action is taken when that is the process. Well, we have yet to see, but
You weren't kidding, it's complicated. Let's take another question from the microphone.
Hello, you spoke of workplace atmosphere, and I was hoping you could share a bit more about managing rumor of sexual misconduct or harassment, especially when the subject of that rumor is in a leadership position.
Who would like to take that question? How about Mariann?
Okay, so I think that's a universally difficult problem in the workplace, the rumor mill, it's referred to. So oftentimes it requires some strategic discussions with key people, some trainings, some setting of expectations, reminding people of confidentiality, that it's important, reminding people of the anti-retaliation policy, because the one thing that rumors can lead to often is a retaliation complaint. And what's tricky about that for the person accused is that the underlying behavior of the alleged harassment doesn't have to have occurred in order to substantiate a retaliation complaint. So they can be very difficult and challenging, and so sometimes just letting people know that they're putting themselves at risk is enough to help them, to help minimize the rumor mill.
Thank you for the question. Do we have another question from the microphone?
Leslie Johnson, City Club member. As you know, the program will get rebroadcast or available on demand for a considerable period of time. So I thought it might be worthwhile for one or more of you to take a moment to speak to the woman at her desk right now, or crying in the bathroom, or getting home late at night and tired, who's experiencing behavior that is making her uncomfortable, and she feels alone and she doesn't know what to do about trying to stop that condition in her employment situation.
I would love to respond to that. I am actually called often by women who are still working, who haven't made a complaint yet. And those are the calls where I feel I can be of the most value. So I appreciate having the opportunity to communicate that message to a broader audience. If you are experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace, you need to come forward. It's very hard. But the protection from retaliation for having made the complaint will be very useful to you down the road. And so you need to examine what your company's sexual harassment policy is, and you need to follow that policy. And if you want input from a lawyer, you should call the National Women's Law Center and find a lawyer, or call me, and you should get feedback. And I have participated in that complaint process on behalf of clients who are still employed, and I'm not asserting any legal claim, but sometimes people are very traumatized and need help, need an advocate. And so a lawyer could serve that role if you feel you don't have one. But I cannot stress enough how important it is to make that complaint, to document in writing that you made the complaint, and then see how the process unfolds. And if you are subject to retaliation, retaliation is much easier to prove than sexual harassment. And there is protection for you if you're retaliated against. And employers realize the ease with which a retaliation can be proven if retaliation is happening. So it happens less often than you would think. But you really you have to make that complaint.
Thank you for the comment. That seems a good place to end our discussion. We want to thank all of you for being here. Thank you to our panel, Dana Sullivan, Lisa Lesage, Mariann Hyland. Let's hear it for our panel. Thank you so much. It's been an honor to be a part of this discussion, and I'll turn it back over to Colin.
Thank you. We are out of broadcast time for the day, and we'll stop. If this program has inspired you to join or contribute to City Club, you can do so at the registration table as you leave the room. This is Colin Jones from City Club's Board of Governors. Thank you to our guests, and special thanks to Emerald Bogue and Leslie Johnson and the Friday Forum Committee for their hard work. This program is adjourned.